Good afternoon. We're excited to have you here joining us for a fireside chat about inclusion in the military and the boardroom. Before we officially kick it off, I wanted to just cover a few housekeeping items. We will be taking Q&A, so you can find the Q&A at the bottom of your icons there. Make sure that you submit your questions, and we'll try to get to each of them. And then just for simplicity, the more browsers you close, the better your system should operate. But we're really excited to have Brigadier General Bernie Banks join us to speak about inclusion and diversity in the military. General Banks is an incredible speaker, an incredible leader, and an incredible scholar. He has 3 masters and a Ph.D. He was the head of Department of Behavioral Sciences and Leadership at West Point and retired as a 1-star Brigadier General. He is now the Associate Dean of Leadership, Leader Development, and Inclusion at Kellogg Graduate School of Management at Northwestern University, which in my opinion is the #1 school in the country. But I obviously have something in common with Bernie there too. Bernie is a 1987 graduate of West Point. He served as an Apache pilot, received the MacArthur Award, which is an incredibly prestigious award for leadership for Army units around the world. He has an MPA from Harvard. He has an MBA from Kellogg. He has a master's from Columbia, and he has a PhD from Columbia. He's really an expert in leader development, and that's why we're proud to have him on the Thayer leadership team. He's also has incredible leadership experiences. So he's not only an expert on the leadership theories, but he's an expert and having been there, done that, and experienced leadership. So welcome, Bernie. Great to have you.
Thank you, Dan. It's wonderful to be here.
So as we look at inclusion and diversity and inclusion, which is obviously a very top of mind topic right now, it's great to have you with all your experience in diversity and inclusion and the Army's experience. As you look at the military and the Army, what do you think about when you think about diversity and inclusion and your experiences in the Army?
Well, I think you have to approach it from 2 angles. One, from the values and morality-based angle. The other from the mission and organizational needs angle. So if we think about it from the Army perspective, our core values compel us to think about how do we create an inclusive environment for all, because one of our core values is respect. Also, the Army has to think about it from a mission readiness perspective. Readiness demands that we access high quality talent. Our ability to attract high quality talent is most certainly related to what that talent will experience if they join the organization. There's research that's been conducted by the Pentagon that shows only 29% of American citizens between the age of 17 to 24 actually qualify for military service today, which means only 10 million out of 34 million are even eligible to think about joining the military. But then there's a tremendous competition for that talent. And so given that the Army is a volunteer-based organization, if we're not creating the right kind of environment to attract the talent that we require, we're not going to be able to accomplish our mission. So diversity, equity, and inclusion is important for a readiness perspective, because you want to find the best talent and you want to retain the best talent. Additionally, it most certainly is the right thing to do from a values and morality-based perspective.
That's you bring up retention, which is an interesting insight, given that the Army, the military as a whole, converted to the all-volunteer force in 1973. And so we really are competing with all of corporate America for the best talent. And prior to COVID, with the lowest unemployment rates, it was challenging to recruit, but also to retain. So what are the challenges that you see the Army and the military having with diversity and inclusion at this time?
So I think the biggest challenge the military has, and the Army in particular, is not finding diverse talent. It's having diverse talent at every echelon of the organization. If you take a look at the enlisted soldier ranks, they're incredibly diverse. If you then look into the commissioned officer ranks, there's diversity, but it exists in the lower half of the rank structure. So there's lots that's being written periodically about the dearth of diverse officers inside the general officer ranks of the military, what would be analogous to the C-suite in private sector organizations. And so you bring in very diverse talent, but there seems to be this petering out in terms of helping that diverse talent access the most senior ranks of the military. And the same thing can be said of the private sector, that if you look at professional services firms, for example, like law firms, that you bring in highly diverse talented people into the junior attorney ranks, but then when you take a look at the partner ranks of the firm, they're not nearly as diverse. And so the military and the private sector both have to think more intently about how are they seeking to develop people throughout their career so that they can unleash the full potential that's resident within them.
A 245-year-old legacy organization that has evolved over time and struggled with this in many different ways. I know when you were first promoted to general, you had a great story about the history of the stars that were pinned on your shoulder, which really related to the incredible leaps we've made forward on diversity. Could you tell us that story about your pinning of general?
Yeah. So I don't tell this story for the purpose of aggrandizement. That's the first thing that people have to understand. But it is instructive about the journey we've been on. So when I was a young captain in the Army, so I had approximately 9 years of military service under my belt, and I had been selected to serve as the executive assistant to a two-star general officer. It's a highly prized position called aide-de-camp. And it gives you an opportunity to view things at the strategic level while you're still working at the tactical level of the organization. And so the general I worked for came from a military family with a very distinguished history. And one day I was in his home and I noticed on the mantle was a set of old sterling silver stars. And I asked his wife what was the background of the stars. And she told me that the stars had been passed down throughout the years from one person to another for somebody who had been mentored by the individual who held the stars previously. And the stars originated with General John J. Pershing, who Pershing was the only 6-star general in the history of the Army until Congress retroactively made George Washington a 6-star general so that Washington would always be the most senior ranking military official in the history of the United States. But John J. Pershing was the only person who had achieved that rank, General of the Armies, while he was on active duty. And Pershing had passed these stars to Douglas MacArthur when he was promoted to 1-star general. And the stars had been handed down over the years. Now, Pershing was an interesting individual in that his nickname was Blackjack. And it was given to him by the cadets at West Point when he was a tactical officer because he was a very disciplined man. But also it was reflective of the fact that he had worked in the segregated Army with African-American soldiers. So the nickname was not a source of great pride. It was a reflection of the fact that here's this person who had worked with blacks and, he was a very stern person. Well, in telling me the story of these stars, I was like, wow, that's fascinating. And the general's wife at that point said, one day I bet those stars are going to find their way to your shoulder. And I laughed and I literally said the following. I was like, you're smoking crack. That will never happen. I'm already several ranks past where I should be given the things I enjoy doing in my off time. And so I just laughed it off, didn't think anything about it. Fast forward circa 2016, when I say to, the general who I maintained a very close relationship, I'm going to be advanced to the rank of brigadier general. And his wife, who was on the call, said, I knew this day would happen. We're going to be there and we're bringing the stars. And I didn't even remember about the stars. And so I was like, what stars? She's like, the Pershing stars. And I was like, oh, I think I remember that. And so he comes to my retirement ceremony and he's telling the story of these stars, how they've been passed down through 7 general officers over the years. and how they were finding their way to my shoulders and what the stars represented in terms of investing in people and the legacy we have as a military and the importance of leading with character and everything. And, the look on my family's face was just one of total awe. And the story I told in that moment wasn't it amazing that in a country like the United States, something like that day could happen, that a set of stars that originated with an individual who received a derisive nickname for having worked with African-American soldiers in an era of segregation, that those stars would one day find their way to the shoulders of an African-American, because while our country isn't perfect, our country is committed to always improving the quality of life and trying to truly live up to the ideas expressed in our Bill of Rights and our Constitution. And so, that's the Army's journey, that the Army has over the years sought to always be a progressive institution to try to make sure that it was leading the vanguard of advancing, how we treat citizens and how we accord people opportunities to live out their dreams. And so now today I am the holder of those stars, and I have an obligation to pass them on to somebody I've mentored at some point in the future. But it really is instructive to think about how the Army has become a more inclusive place over time because of that commitment to trying to always think about what's the right thing to do and what's the right thing to do from a mission perspective.
Yeah, that's a fantastic story about legacies and about the organization improving over time, going back into John J. President was an 1886 graduate of West Point, so we're going back a ways. And really that leads us to, in this increased focus on diversity and inclusion, like what opportunities do you see that this opens up in terms of talent development and other areas that corporations can focus on the opportunity side?
Well, a few things, so what we know are heterogeneous teams outperform homogeneous teams. So to solve complex challenges, you need to access diverse perspectives. And what we also know is diversity efforts don't fail because we can't find diverse people or ideas. They typically fall short because we find them and then culturally encourage them to act in a homogeneous manner. And so diversity is never the intent, inclusion is. In order to create more collaborative organizations that can foster better innovation, that can meet the challenges presented by a dynamic environment, you have to work on having a diverse talent pool. You have to work on treating everyone equitably. You have to create an inclusive culture to unleash the intellect and the passion that exists within the organization so that you can address the complex challenges that are required for your organization to thrive going forward. So I think the opportunity to say, how can we be more innovative because of being more inclusive is an opportunity that the military and the private sector has to seize upon. There's a great study that was done by Deloitte. It's also done by a number of other firms, but taking a look at the average age of a company on the S&P 500 back in 1958 was 61 years, lifespan, not the age, the lifespan of the company, 61 years. Fast forward to today, that lifespan is anywhere from 15 to 18 years, lifespan. By 2027, it's projected that 75% of the companies that are currently on the S&P 500 will no longer exist. If you are not driving an inclusive culture that creates collaboration, that fosters innovation, you are putting your organization at a competitive disadvantage in a highly dynamic world. So the greatest opportunity that I think every organization has is to create a more inclusive environment so that they can generate the innovation necessary to maintain their relevance.
Mm-hmm. So what roadblocks would you say the U.S. Army has overcome that might help instruct corporate executives who are now struggling with some issues that the Army might have already solved?
One is combating bias. So bias manifests itself in a variety of ways. If we take the military, for example, our recent decision to open up combat arms to women. So there were a select set of career fields in the military that previously were off limits to women because of some institutional bias that existed around gender roles. Well, we moved off of that and said, hey, it shouldn't be about gender. It should be about the ability to meet a standard. And so once you moved off this notion of, hey, certain roles are just exclusively the dominant domain of men, and it's just about whoever meet the standards associated with what the role requires, then you open up the aperture and you can create great outcomes. The first 3 women to graduate from Ranger School were all West Point graduates, and that's not an accident. It's because West Point had been a place that pushes everybody to achieve high standards, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, religion, creed, name your thing. And the overwhelming majority of women that have completed Ranger School since then have been West Point graduates. And so the opportunity to take a look at actively combating bias, resetting to make sure it's about what are the things that are actually necessary to do that well. It's things like that that create tremendous opportunities in the military and in the private sector as well.
And speaking of the private sector, we've worked with so many companies at their leadership that we brought you in to speak with the executives about how to really bring this topic into the boardroom to make a meaningful difference, to better the organization. What advice would you have to corporate executives on how to make a difference in this area to better their organizations?
To me, it all comes back to accountability. You have to have accountability for these efforts. It can't just be something you talk about. It has to be something you actually commit to. And so there's a great article written by Peter Bregman, 2016 Harvard Business Review, that says 5 things are necessary to drive accountability. 1 are clear expectations. So can the organization set clear expectations around this topic? 2, clear capability. Do you provide the resources necessary to meet your expectations? Do you have the people who can meet your expectations? 3, clear measurement. It's been said that which is measured is that which is valued. You have to measure these efforts. 4, clear feedback. Objective, timely, free from judgment. 5, clear consequence. If a company wants to get after this, they have to do all 5 things. Be very clear about their expectations. Put lines in the sand. Make sure you have the resources necessary to meet those expectations. Measure what you're doing. Provide people feedback routinely with regards to how they're doing in terms of meeting the expectations, and assign consequence to it. Because if it's just a nice to do as opposed to a must do, people will find a way to opt out. The best companies meet all 5 of those things, and that's how they're moving the needle on their efforts.
That's great, Bernie. Why don't we go to Q&A? We'll take a few questions from the audience. The first question is, in your experience in the Army, can you give an example of an experience you had where a unit achieved diversity and inclusion in improving the organization?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll go back to an experience from my own example. So I grew up in the Apache helicopter community, which is the attack helicopter community. So women had flown a number of airframes in the military for a number of years, but the Apache community was off limits to women for a number of years. And so approximately 1994, they opened up the Apache community to women. So first couple come through flight school, they end up in military organizations, and they're they could be the only woman in their organization. And so it was a tough environment for women. Now, if you fast forward to when I was the commander of a squadron in 2004, I had 6 directors that ran each of the flight organizations that fell under me. 2 out of the 6 were commanded by women. I had women cascaded throughout the organization in a variety of roles, and that organization was as diverse could be. It was also an extraordinarily high-performing organization because we had built a culture that said we prize every single member of the organization. When I took over the organization, it wasn't that diverse. Did not have those women in those roles. Organization, when I took over, was ranked in the bottom 3rd globally on the metrics we take a look at for KPIs for aviation organizations. But by bringing in a more diverse set of people, by really fostering this notion of inclusion, by having high standards and holding everyone to those standards, and saying it doesn't matter where you come from, it matters what you're committed to doing while you're here, although we're going to embrace where you come from and leverage those unique insights as part of what happens while we're here. Within 2 years, that organization went from being ranked in the bottom third globally to being ranked number 1 globally. It was more diverse than it had been when I took over. It was more inclusive than it had been when I took over. The fact that those things happened while I was there was not solely because of me, but as the official commander of the organization, as the person in charge, I made it a priority and I held people accountable for ensuring that we were driving those inclusion efforts throughout the organization. And the proof was in the pudding. You take a look at the journey they went on and the improvement across the board on all our KPIs. It was because we had a diverse team. We treated people in equitable ways. We fostered inclusion for all. And we said that we are all committed to ensuring that every person here is put in a position to win. And I submit that a leader, one of the leader's core jobs is to put every one of their people and every one of their teams in a position to win. And fostering inclusion is one of the ways in which you do that.
That's fantastic. Well, diversity also includes veterans, and being Veterans Day, happy Veterans Day, General.
Thank you. Same to you.
Thank you. How can you help corporate executives understand how increasing support of the military, support of veterans, and particularly military spouses, how can companies improve their organizations by supporting diversity in that area?
So if you think about the talent you want as part of your organization, you want talent that others have elected to invest in prior to you're making a decision to invest in them. And so if you just think about the amazing array of resources that have been poured into veterans and their families in service of making them the best that they can be, not electing to access that as part of your talent pool just seems like it would be such a suboptimal way to approach your business. Take, for example, here at Northwestern Kellogg, if we ask the question when a new MBA class arrives, how many of you have had a direct report before arriving at business school? Maybe 25% of the class's hands will go up. How many of you have had 2 or more direct reports? Half the hands go down. How many of you have had 5 or more direct reports? Almost invariably, the only hands remaining are those of the veterans. Coming straight out of their undergraduate education, they were handed the keys to a lot of human beings. And it's not just to the service members, also to the service members' families. Yep. So they've led from the outset of their professional careers. They were part of organizations that extolled the virtues of adhering to a code of ethics, thinking about professionalism in a very different way, ensuring that discipline was a cornerstone of their actions and that character had to be immutable. And so you can bring all of those attributes into your organization. You can teach them what to do in your organization, but what's more important to your organization is who they are at their core. They have an identity that's rooted in competence and character and service that is extremely attractive to any organization. You can teach them how to do accounting. You can teach them how, but what this notion of to be responsible, this notion of what it means to have unquestioned integrity, this notion of fighting through difficult circumstances and putting the mission first. You know, all of those things are things that you can access in your organization when you bring veterans on board.
No, absolutely. And one thing that I never really thought of until recently, somebody reminded me that, imagine if your entire workforce had free education that they could take at night. And every veteran coming out nowadays has the GI Bill, the 9/11 GI Bill, and they can all go for free to get their graduate degrees or their bachelor's, whatever they come in. So hiring veterans, they also have that additional asset, which I think is really unique. So the last question I'd like to close out with, Bernie, was how do you think a diverse culture helps companies operate in a VUCA environment, a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environment like we're in right now?
Having a diverse workforce allows you access to diverse perspectives. So if we think about this, current research indicates there's 7.7 billion people on this planet. By 2050 to 2064, according to what research you look at, that number is expected to grow from 7.7 to 9.7 billion people. So 2 billion more people on the planet over the course of the next 30 years. While international mobility is expected to remain constant, there's going to be 2 billion more people contained in that number that's working outside their countries. 1 billion of the 2 billion of growth is going to come from just 7 countries. Population in Europe is expected to decrease. Population in sub-Saharan Africa is expected to explode. And the majority of growth as it pertains to this 2 billion is coming from people of color. As we think about the changes that are happening demographically around the world, as we think about changes that are happening with regards to technology or the environment, name your thing, being able to access those diverse perspectives is not a nice to do, but a must do. If you want to learn how to contend more successfully with the VUCA environment, you need to bring in the diversity of perspective that people around the world have, not just people from a select part of the world. And so I go back to the research that shows complex challenges are always better addressed by heterogeneous teams. You want the most diverse team possible so you can unleash the most diverse perspectives so that you can create solutions to these challenges that otherwise you would not come upon if you simply had a bunch of folks thinking about the challenge who all had similar backgrounds and thus they approached the challenge in a similar way.
That's fantastic. I'd really like to thank General Banks for your time on Veterans Day, for your service and your leadership to the nation. Thank you and have an awesome day.
Thank you, Dan. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you. I'd like to wrap this up just by saying, we're at Thayer Leadership. We're based at West Point in the historic Thayer Hotel. And in our position, we're just honored to be able to give back in different ways. And many ways we do that are by partnering with the NASDAQ, like we've done here, and partnering with Chief Executive to help identify companies that are supporting and honoring military veterans, military and their families, and in particular military spouses. We have probably done one of the best things we've ever done is hire military spouses. Over half of our team are military spouses, and they're incredibly talented. And when they leave West Point, they stay with our team. And that's been a great lesson for us in supporting the military and supporting the families. As a veteran-owned company, we're committed to hiring, and not only hiring, but I think everybody has to focus on training and retaining military veterans. We're also committed to training the military leadership principles. We've had over 100,000 executives come to West Point. In this way, we hope we're helping to bridge the military-civilian gap that exists in our country, and people leave with a new respect for the military, our soldiers, and the principles that help our military lead in a VUCA environment. For the millions of military veterans and their families, it's a very thankful day. I'd like to thank you all for participating in this. And to this end, I'd like to show you the U.S. Military Academy Cadet Glee Club singing their rendering of God Bless America.
God bless
Thank you for participating in our Veterans Day celebrations. 2021 is going to be an incredible year. God bless America. Have a great Veterans Day.